All right, and so in case you couldn't hear me, I'll review that again, but I wanted to let you know that we are using the chat function. So if you have any questions, use the drop-down function for the question part in the webinar. And we also have 4 different handouts. So on the right-hand side, there's a little drop-down for handouts. We have 4 PDFs there. One is the grant application. Another is a PDF of Parks and Wildlife's programs and sites. And then we have our co-op program guidance document, which I'll be referencing page numbers for all the different topics throughout the webinar. And we also have a SMART goal guidance document, which will help you out with the application portion when we get to the SMART goal section. I also wanted to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available at any time in the resources section of Recreation Grants Online. I also wanted to let you know that we have an ASL interpreter with us today who is live for anyone with hearing impairments. If you prefer not to see that video on your screen, you can minimize it or you can expand it however you'd like. So that is an option. All right, and so with all of those housekeeping issues, we'll go ahead and get started. And again, I want to thank you so much for joining. We're very excited about this upcoming grant. So the Community Outdoor Outreach Program's purpose is to provide grant funding to tax-exempt organizations for programs that engage underrepresented populations in parks and wildlife, mission-oriented outdoor recreation, conservation, and environmental education activities. So what does that mean? We typically have grant projects that include a number of different types of projects, such as summer camps, community camping programs, outdoor adventure clubs, after-school clubs for environmental education, youth development recreation programs, PE courses that do archery, fishing, kayaking, all of those types of activities that you would associate with Texas Parks and Wildlife. A little bit about our history. Our program began in 1996 in a response for the need to diversify audiences visiting our sites and engaging in programs. Instead of creating in-house programming, we wanted to support partners who already have these deep relationships with community members to grow their outdoor programs via grant dollars. Thus, we started the Co-op Grant Program. Funds for this program are derived from a percentage of money collected from the sporting goods sales tax, which includes fishing, hunting, camping gear, all of those supplies that would support any of the programming. Over the past 25 years, we've awarded 770 grants for a total of about $21 million throughout the state of Texas. Typically, our grants provide funding in the amount of $750,000 to $1.5 million annually, which can typically support about 20 to 40 different organizations. This year, it will be a little bit less just because of all the circumstances with COVID and a few budget cuts. We don't know the specific numbers yet, but we are expecting it to be a little bit more of a competitive year because we will not have as many funds available. To balance our reduced funds, we have dropped down the maximum cap for grant awards this year. It used to be $50,000, and now the maximum cap will be $30,000. So the grant range will be between $5,000 and $30,000. This is a reimbursement grant, meaning you must purchase items first, then submit a request for reimbursement after the fact. This process typically takes about 4 to 6 weeks, give or take, so your organization must have the ability and cash flow available to support this type of structure. A one-time advance of 10% will be available upfront for your organization. And another thing we wanted to stress this year is that we have a brand new deadline. And so we have bumped up the deadline for this year to November 6th. It used to be in February, then it was in December, but now we have November 6th. And this is a hard cutoff. So our system will no longer let you submit any application after 5 p.m. Central Time on November 6th, no exceptions. So at 5 o'clock, it locks down and you can no longer submit that application. All right, so the main purpose of the grant program is to really target those underrepresented populations. And what do we mean by that? We have 4 target demographics that we would like to serve through the co-op grant program. Those include low-income participants, females, ethnic minority, and what we mean by that is really non-Anglo participants, and then individuals with physical or mental disabilities. And I'll go over all of this in much greater detail throughout the application. For eligibility, we have a complete list of eligibility rules on page 4 in your program guidance. Again, you can find this document in the handout section on the right-hand side of your screen in the webinar functions. That program guidance offers a lot more detailed information about all of the different aspects of this program. I won't go over all of these individual items in detail, but I just wanted to hit some of the main points and some of the changes for this particular year. So the first one, we're going to go over the SAM registration. So this is the System for Award Management. It's a federal system. In the past, you had to be registered in SAM. We actually no longer have that requirement. You just need to be in good standing with SAM. And so if you don't have an account with the System for Award Management as of now, that's okay. That means you're in good standing. If you do have an account and something is flagged, then you will not be eligible for this program. Again, we do have a new amount cap, which is $30,000 instead of the $50,000. And then any past grants that are closed within 60 days prior will not be, or I'm sorry, if you have a previous grant, let's say you were funded in 2019 and you've decided to extend your grant, then you will not be able to apply for this year. You can only apply once every 2 years. And so for all of our 2019 grants, as long as you close out on time, the November deadline, then you'll be perfectly eligible for this program. You cannot subgrant any of these grant dollars to other organizations who have previous grants, and it's our way to maintain that certain organizations don't receive multiple different grants through our organization. And then another new eligibility factor is that you must have at least one direct relationship with Texas Parks and Wildlife, and we'll go over this in much greater detail later, but going back to the purpose of this grant program, we just want to make sure that you have at least one of those relationships with our program. Supported activities. We typically support any activity that you would associate with Texas Parks and Wildlife. So any of those outdoor recreation activities, environmental education, conservation, cultural resource exploring, hunting, hiking, camping, fishing, all of those types of things that you would think about Texas Parks and Wildlife are eligible for grant funds. There's a full list of all of these supported activities on page 5 of your program guidance. And items that are ineligible or activities that are ineligible. This is not a construction grant. In our specific division within the agency, we have a lot of other grant programs that are construction grants, such as building a park or building a trail, building a boat ramp, those types of things. This is not a construction grant, so we are really focused on supporting the programming and the associated costs with that programming. We cannot allow special events such as Earth Days, festivals, or other events that are open to the general public. And so this is a common disallowed item that people include in their application. The problem is that the target demographics are really key for this grant program, and it's nearly impossible to estimate or collect demographic data during those special events because typically people don't register, they just kind of show up. And we want to make sure that you're able to collect that information and report it during the grant. And again, for a complete list of these ineligible activities, please reference page 5 of your program guidance document. And training only projects. For projects that are, let's say, professional development for teachers, those are items that we are not able to support. And so we can support some training. So let's say you have a program that's just professional development for teachers. Because the emphasis of that program is not on the participants themselves, we don't typically support that project. However, if you did have one component of that program that was doing professional development for training, but then you also incorporated the actual work with the participants, then we could support that. There just needs to be that other aspect of, let's say, the teachers working with the students, and that be part of the grant scope. And so if you had any questions about the training only portion of that, that's what we're meaning by that. Eligible expenses. So we can support personnel and fringe, training, participant liability insurance, food, travel expenses, fees, and that could be camp entry fees, program entry fees, all of that kind of thing, and then trailers. All allowable and disallowed expenses are listed on page 10 through 13 in your program guidance. And I'll go over each one of these with a little bit more detail. But personnel, that can include salary, hourly, intern, contracts, stipends, all of those different types of personnel and their associated fringe. We can support all of those. One big change for this year is that we no longer have our 40% cap on personnel. So it used to be that you could only request up to 40% of your total budget for personnel. We have removed that cap. And so we were realizing that a lot of organizations, their primary expenses were personnel, and we wanted to help support that. And so especially with, let's say, environmental education programs, your primary expense is going to be the people to actually provide that education to their participants. And so we have removed that cap. And so if you wanted to request a grant for 100% personnel, that is now allowable. We hope that that can help out some of our organizations in the future. For training, this can include first aid, wilderness first aid, anything that's directly related to the program. And this could be training for your participants or training for your staff. Participant liability insurance, this includes the cost for supporting those participants. This does not include your directors and officers insurance, vehicles insurance, or property insurance. Unfortunately, we cannot support any of those types of insurance. It's only for that participant liability insurance. And for travel expenses, you can request gas or mileage. You cannot request both for the same event, because that would technically be double dipping. But if you needed to purchase gas or mileage, that's completely fine. We actually use the federal mileage rate for this grant. Or we can support you renting vehicles or renting trailers for the specific event. That is completely allowable. Unfortunately, for travel expenses, we cannot support anything with a motor, which I'll go over in just a second, but that means that we cannot support purchasing a vehicle or anything like that, but we can support the rental of those vehicles. For fees, that includes program fees, entry fees, camping fees, all of those types of items that would directly support your program. Unfortunately, we cannot support any fees that are paid directly to your organization. And so if you're trying to set up a scholarship fund for your organization, we couldn't just give you a flat rate for that scholarship. We would want to support those actual individual items that have receipts tied to them for your particular programming. And then, of course, trailers. We can also support all of those typical supplies that you'd have to run your program. That could include recreation gear, environmental education materials, telescopes, microscopes, water testing supplies, all of those types of items that fall into your general EE. Education trunks, safety gear, and then if you have a service project component to your project, we can support all the materials for the service project as well. For ineligible expenses, a complete list of ineligible expenses, again, is found between pages 10 and 13 of your program guidance. A few of the things I'll mark here is that we cannot support any advertising or marketing expenses, and anything with a motor. Just like I mentioned earlier, we cannot support a vehicle, a generator, we cannot support refrigerators, anything like that that have a motor tied to them, we cannot support that. Arts and crafts is a common disallowed item. It has to go back to the root of this program, and unfortunately we're not an art supporting program, and so the initial intent for co-op is really those environmental education or outdoor recreation activities, so we cannot support the arts and crafts. Like I mentioned earlier, there's no scholarships that are paid to yourself or no of those other just general program fees that would be paid to yourself. We want to actually support the individual expenses for your project. And then another big one is storage buildings. We cannot support any type of storage, but we like to say that we can support trailers, and this could be a covered trailer, which can also serve as a storage, but it's a storage on wheels that you can take to all of your events. And so we do have a lot of organizations that will request a covered trailer, have their items in that trailer, and then pull that trailer out to their site when they're getting ready to do their activities. A general timeline for your event. So applications opened in August, so they are now open. We do have that new application deadline on November 6th of 2020. Grant awards will be announced on March 1st of 2021. And so with that, your period of activities will need to be between March 1st, 2021 and September 1st, 2022. It's an 18-month window of when activities will take place. If you include any activities that will be before March 1st of 2021, or after September 1st of 2022, unfortunately, we will disallow those activities from your budget. They must all fall during that timeline. There will be a grant management workshop in late March after we make the awards, and that's where we'll go over all of the rules and regulations, details on how to submit a reimbursement request, all of those things that you'll need to know to manage your grant. If you're awarded a grant, you'll also be submitting quarterly reports every 3 months. Your first one will be due on April 15th. That'll be a partial month, but then after that, it's every 3 months. And then you will have a final report at the end of your grant project that will be due no later than 45 days after your grant period ends. And with that, before I move on to scoring criteria, I wanted to just address some of the questions that we do have in the chat box. And bear with me one moment. I'm going to just skim through here, and I'll see if I can help answer any of the general questions. So there's a question on if the organization is able to choose what pay rate will be given through the grant period. If you have your own personnel, all we're really looking for is that that pay rate for your personnel is reasonable. And so I hope that answers your question, but we're really looking to make sure that that's reasonable. So if you have, let's say, a program coordinator there and you're listed at giving them $150,000 salary annually, we may not support that because that might not be considered reasonable for our from our fiscal team. And so just keep that in mind. That's really what we're looking for to make sure that that rate is reasonable. There's another question on if we support the planting of natural plant species in a localized area. Absolutely. And so we do have some projects who do service projects. The main thing you need to look at is that the plants that are sourced to that or are native. If they're non-native or invasive species, we will actually not allow that for reimbursement. Again, going back to the mission of Parks and Wildlife, we want to make sure that those natural areas really thrive and are healthy. So we do support native plantings. There's a question on if the grant will allow hiring a third party to teach programming. We do allow some subcontracting. You want to make sure that that's pretty detailed on what that subcontracting will include. And again, you cannot subcontract to any other organization who has a current co-op grant. So you want to keep that in mind. We do have a list in our resources section in Recreation Grants Online of all of the grant awards that we've given out in the last 2 years. And so you want to make sure to look at that list to make sure nobody is on that list that you'd be subcontracting to. There's a question about travel expenses and if a gift card is available for families to attend. Unfortunately, we could not do that. We don't really allow gift cards through our program, and that would need to be for a particular expense for one of your staff or something like that. And so we could support the reimbursement for your staff going out there, but we cannot support a general gift card to give to families to attend that event in the future. All right, and some of the other questions are a little bit more specific to your program. And if that's the case, I will send you an email after the webinar because I'm the only one managing this that will answer some of those questions. And so just kind of keep in mind. There is another question about if underserved populations includes women. Absolutely, female is one of our target demographics. All right, so with that, I will move on to our scoring criteria. If you have had a grant in either or applied for a grant in 2019 or earlier, the scoring criteria is brand new. Last year was the first year that we implemented our new scoring criteria and we completely changed everything. And so one of the things that we like to say is for this year's scoring criteria, there's a really big emphasis on the quality and impact to participants instead of just the number of participants served. And so please keep that in mind. You'll definitely see that throughout the scoring criteria. I'm not going to go really in depth on each one of the scoring criteria components, but there is the scoring criteria is listed in your program guidance document. The first of our scoring criteria is co-op priorities. A complete list of co-op priorities is on page 3 of your program guidance, and that is addressing co-op priorities and what those mean. Those priorities are derived from Texas Parks and Wildlife's Land and Water Resources Conservation Plan. So if you're curious where those came from, we take those directly from our agency. There's another section that is the connection to Parks and Wildlife. So as I mentioned earlier, you're required to have at least one direct relationship to Texas Parks and Wildlife. What we mean by this is that either your participants are visiting Texas Parks and Wildlife facilities, such as state parks, state natural areas, fisheries, all of those types of facilities, or they're integrating Texas Parks and Wildlife education programs for the participants, or the participants are working directly with Parks and Wildlife staff. We'll have a little bit more detail on these connections to Parks and Wildlife when we start going through the applications. And again, the program guidance has much more information on the specific language for all of these scoring criteria. The next scoring criteria is for underserved populations. This has a total of 30 points associated with it. And so because there's 30 out of 100 points that are for this particular area, it's important to know that this is a really important section of it, and it really speaks back to the primary purpose of this grant program. Those 4 target demographics that I mentioned earlier are going to be scored upon here, and I'll go over later in detail how that really looks like within the application. And then we're also scoring if you have a clear estimate with likely assurances that you'll meet those demographics and a clear plan to collect and report on the actual demographics served. The next scoring criteria is the expected impact. And again, this is another important section. It's worth 30 points on your grant scoring. This includes SMART goals. And we're really making sure that your SMART goals are well developed and are consistent with what's included in your narrative. And we'll go over the SMART goals in further detail in a little bit. We're looking at if you are developing lifelong behaviors over time, so will there be a change in behavior over time? Are these repeat experiences or long-term exposure for participants, those types of items? If you have any natural resource leadership components in your grant application, that's another aspect that we're looking at. It's definitely not required. Not all of our grants have this component, but if you do, you will receive some extra points based on this. And also if you have an active engagement approach. So are these participants actually engaging in kayaking and these other activities, or are they watching a demonstration? If they're actually engaging in these activities, you will receive a higher point value during the scoring process. And last but not least, the environmental benefits associated with your project. So is there a service project component that has these related environmental benefits? Not all of our grant applications have a service project component into it. And if you don't, that's completely fine. Many of them still get funded. But if you do have a service project, you can receive points for your project. Next is the timeline and budget, which is worth 20 points. So we're really looking at to see if your timeline is achievable and consistent with the rest of the application. And then for your budget, are these items relevant to the application? Are they allowable? Have you really planned out and thought about all of the different other items that are needed for your project? And then we're also looking at if the amount requested is reasonable in relationship to the benefit of your participants. And so are you requesting the full grant award for a one-time 1 hour, or are you looking for a more continued program that has more of an in-depth experience for your participants? And then we move on to organizational capacity, which is worth 5 points. This one's pretty basic. Again, it's only worth 5 points, but we're making sure that the scope is within your organization's scope. We're making sure that you have qualified staff and or partnerships associated with your project. And we want to make sure that you're going to be continuing similar activities in the future. So we don't want to give you all of these items to support this type of programming, and then after the grant ends, you're completely done. You won't be continuing this and you sell all of your supplies. We don't want that to happen. And last in this section is a past performance deduction. And so if you've never had a grant before, you don't need to worry about this section at all. This is only for past grantees who have closed their grant within 2 years from the application deadline. Previously, there was no accountability if you didn't implement a project as proposed, or there's little accountability. In this new scoring criteria, we wanted to change it so that we have measures in place to emphasize the importance of being realistic and following through with what you had proposed. We want to make sure that you're actually doing what you said you were going to do in your application. And so we do have a few deductions if you've had a grant that was open in the last 2 years. So if you had any remaining grant funds, there is a certain calculation for deduction there. If you did not meet any of your contract requirements, there can be a deduction. If you were unresponsive to any of our communications, so if we were requesting documents and we're not providing that, then there may be a deduction. Or if you were consistently late with reporting or did not submit specific reporting, there could be a scoring deduction as well. Again, the entire scoring system is out of 100 points. And so this deduction is up to 20 points deduction for any past non-compliance issues. With that, I'm going to take another break and head on over to the chat to see if we have any questions that I can answer. There's a question on if grant money can be used to reimburse volunteers that come out to support the activity. It really depends on what those expenses would be. And so if they're volunteers, they're not typically paid. And so we wouldn't have any sort of payment to those volunteers. Now, if you're contracting with people who are going to be supporting your program, we can absolutely support that. But we can support if there's transportation for your volunteers to get out to the site and they document that that transportation costs, such as mileage, you can pay the volunteers for that, and we can reimburse you for those amounts. There's a question on where you can find previous grantees that were funded. When we log into Recreation Grants Online, and we'll show you all of this later, there's a resources section that has a PDF of all of our past press releases, so you can see exactly who we have funded in the past. There's a question on if you're paying, let's say, a program coordinator, how this reimbursement would work. I'll go over this in a little bit more detail later on, but essentially you would need a timesheet for that employee, and then we would need to have a proof of payment that that person was paid along with the timesheet, and then our fiscal team can reimburse you for those costs. So you will pay that employee first, and then you'll show us all of the proper documentation, and then we will reimburse you for those expenses. There's a question on if the item listed on the grant, if it changes, can the money be used for a similar item or a same type of item? So once you're awarded a grant, we will have some flexibility. So you can do amendments to add new items to your budget. Or if you decide, if you had both kayaks and fishing supplies listed on your budget and you decided you wanted to purchase more kayaks and less fishing supplies, that's completely fine. So there is some flexibility there. The only time that you cannot replace items is if in your application, if you included disallowed expenses, we will just remove that expense and the associated amount from your budget, and you cannot replace that with anything new. The biggest thing to keep in mind that if you're awarded a grant is you cannot exceed the amount that you were awarded. So if you realize later on that you had some expenses that you were missing, we cannot give you additional funds for those. You'll need to reduce expenses from another area for any new items that you want to purchase. This PowerPoint will be available at the end in the resources section. So if you feel the need to jot down everything, this will be available. And this PowerPoint will also be recorded for future use. So there's a question with hunting about if this grant would be available to include more than one hunt or fishing program. Absolutely. And so if your program is incorporated of several different hunts and several different fishing programs, you can have multiple aspects to your grant project. And so you could have, let's say, 3 completely different grant components that are all under one grant scope. That is completely allowable. In your grant application, just make sure to break it down per type of program of, for our hunting program, this is exactly what we're doing. For our fishing program, this is exactly what we're doing. Just be clear. Again, we cannot support any sort of construction, so no construction of shooting sports facilities for special needs is eligible. We do have a separate grant program within our agency that will support shooting ranges. Unfortunately, that's just not for this particular grant program. For the service project, there's a question on if I could detail this a little bit more, what would be allowable. Any service project that's directly related to natural resources would be allowable. So a park cleanup would be allowable, any sort of restoration project, all of those would be allowable. It just must be related to natural resources. So we could not do any service projects that were, let's say, for like tutoring or general food handout, any of those types of things, because they're not directly related to our grant mission. T-shirts are allowable for attendees, so you absolutely can use grant money for t-shirts. There's a question on if swimming and water safety is considered an eligible sport. We do have parks that have outdoor swimming. You just want to make sure it's an outdoor swimming facility. And so if you have a swimming facility that's indoors, that's really teaching people how to do lap swimming and all of that, that would not be eligible. And of course, any other typical sports like baseball, basketball, soccer, all of those are not eligible for our program as well. So there's a question on if people part of the co-op grant are salaried teachers, can we pay them for their weekend time during events? Absolutely. And so if they're a salaried teacher and that this weekend event is above the scope of what they're getting paid for through the school, you can contract to those teachers and pay them, let's say, a stipend or a contract amount for the work they're doing on that weekend. We just want to make sure it's outside of their typical support of what their salary would be. But if it's in addition to, so if it's an extra component, you can absolutely pay for those salaries. We can support interns, so that is absolutely an allowable expense. And they can support with coordinating the program, such as an environmental education club. Yes, you can absolutely have an internship expense for that. All right, so now I'm going to pass over the baton to Blake Powers, which is our system analyst who does all of our work with our Recreation Grants Online system, and he's going to do a brief overview on our new Recreation Grants Online 2020 program where you'll be submitting applications. So Blake, it's on to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Blake Powers. I'm the system analyst here with Recreation Grants. My primary role with Recreation Grants is to design and administer the Recreation Grants online system. Last year, we began the transition to a new Recreation Grants online system, and that new system is called Argo 2020. Argo 2020 is a really cool product. It's a lot more designed specifically for what we do, and it's also designed to help some things that were confusing in the old system be more clear and obvious in terms of their use. So I'm just going to hit a couple of the broad bullet points today, and I'm going to direct you to where you can find a lot of answers to the questions you have without even needing to write them down, because we've created an extensive resource section for how to use this product, and also for the programmatic questions you might have about applying for a co-op grant. So first of all, applications are open in Argo 2020 for co-op 2021 grants right now. You know, it's a good idea, even if you're not ready to apply. But if you plan to apply, to go ahead and follow the steps that we're going to cover here to create an account for your sponsor organization and for the person who will be the administrator of that organization. So we'll do a little screen demo in a moment, but essentially, if you know where our Recreation Grants website is, then you can find a link on our website that says Apply Manage. And then once you go to that link, you're going to be directed with an option that if you're applying for a grant in 2020 or later, to click here. And that's going to take you to our new Argo 2020 online grant management system. You're going to need to select someone to be an administrator for your organization. And what that is, that's essentially the person that controls who the members of your organization are. All right. And the other thing about the administrator role is that's the person that has to, at minimum, start the grant application. Okay. This is done so that somebody couldn't just log into your organization on your behalf and create a whole bunch of applications without you knowing. So this is designed so that somebody in the organization is the responsible party. Once you submit your request to create an account for your organization and it's approved, then other people can easily request to join the organization, or you can add them. And I'll show you where you can find the resources that show you how to do those things. The important thing to remember about this sponsor administrator role is that you can initiate a new application, you can assign and remove members to your organization, and then you can edit and save documents within the application. Now, only a person with an administrator role can submit the application, but the cool thing about our product is, let's say you run an organization with 10 or 12 people, and they're gonna run different projects. You can make each one of them a staff member in the organization, but you can make them an administrator on the application itself, okay? So that's a little confusing, but once you get in the system, it's pretty easy to determine the difference there. And then I know that we do have some folks that are consultants that assist co-op organizations. Consultants, you can look at the application in our resources section for any of our grant opportunity programs, even without getting an account. If you want to assist an organization with an account, you'll need to join the grant consultants during the sign-up process, and then the organization will need to add you to their application in that capacity. We don't want you to add yourself to their actual sponsor organization, because if there comes a time when they no longer retain your services, then you're still going to get all the emails and updates about the management of their grant. So this allows us to easily add you and then remove you from applications once your responsibilities are done. And again, just to cover, the organization administrator will initiate a new application and add the desired consultant to the application in a security role that's specific to what they want. So again, just to reiterate this, I would suggest that you go to create your organization account and the associated accounts as soon as possible, even if you aren't ready to complete your application. The reason for this is you don't want the technology to get in your way at the last minute when you're scrambling to get your resources for the actual application itself together. Just make this one less thing you have to worry about. And then the applications on the new system have more error checks than the old system. This is designed so that you know, we want you to the system to guide you in such a way that you presented your application with the required fields that our team needs to score and evaluate it. So you know, the old system, it was possible sometimes to submit an application and the system did not check for an error that would have let you know, hey, you're asking for too little or too much money in your budget, or hey, you haven't supplied the primary contact for your organization. Those kind of things make the application ineligible. But if the system had just told you during the application process, hey, you need to fix this, then you could have fixed it and made sure that your application was presented in the way that it would need to be to put your project in the best light. The big thing to note is the budgets will take longer than the prior system. And that's because in the old system, you could just upload an Excel spreadsheet, but in the new system, the entire reimbursement process, should you get a grant, is going to work off of the budget form. So you're always going to know how much money is available, what your budget, your approved budget looked like. It will make the project a lot easier to manage in the long term, but in the short term, it may take you a little bit longer during the application process to complete that information. So just plan accordingly. And what we're going to do is we're going to just really briefly cover the recreation, what this process looks like in Recreation Grants online system. So essentially, when you do go to the Recreation Grants website, and we'll just look at that real quickly here. If you were to go here and type Rec Grants TPWD, right, you're going to see a link to our website here, right? This typing TPWD, make sure that it searches our subdomain here. Clicking this and clicking Apply Manage leads you to this page, and this is the link we're talking about to access Argo 2020, and that will open here, right? Now, if you come here for the first time and you're not sure if you want to create an account, we have all of these resources, and these resources for the co-op grant program allow you to access the application, any potential documents that would be required during the application process. Some of the things here include the scoring criteria. We'll have a link to this webinar here eventually. We'll have a link to various kinds of webinars. And then after you, if you do receive an award, because of COVID-19, some of our grant management workshops are delivered in modules here. So these resources are really important to keep track of, right? They're always here for you. And then if you have questions about the system, this Quick Start user guide literally walks you through every part of the process, from how to access the login page, to how to request access for your sponsor organization, how to add other folks, how to view and apply, and how to add and remove users. But just to quickly go over this process, if you need to request an account, you'll click the new user link, right? And this will be the user information that you fill out for yourself. You'll have to have a username. This system's a little bit different in the sense that the old system worked off of your email. This one works off of this username. So you can have any email you want and you can change that at any time, but this username is fixed and that's what's unique in the system. You'll have some password requirements that you have to fulfill. The system has, I think it requires a capital letter, some numbers, and one punctuation character. And then this is the big part. If you already have an organization in the system, if somebody's already come in and set it up for you, you can select this drop-down menu and find it and request to join it. Now that doesn't mean you're going to automatically join it. I'm going to review the request and make sure that you're trying to join an organization that has authorized you to join. However, if that does not exist, which is probably the case for most of you, you're going to choose this box that says my organization is not listed, okay? And then you're going to have to create your organization and your user account at the same time. As you fill this out, most of this is pretty straightforward. Let's say you're the city of Arlenia. Your short name really doesn't matter. I would try to make it similar to this. Your address for your organization is going to be whatever that information is. County is pretty obvious. Phone is pretty obvious. The key is when you get down to these areas that apply to certain organizations but not others. If there's one that doesn't apply to you, so for example, if you're a small nonprofit and not a government entity, but this is still a required field, just type 9s until it will not let you type anymore. That's all you need to do. Same for any field on here. If you'll notice the required number of characters is slightly different for each field, you just want to make sure that that field has to be populated, but it doesn't actually have to have information that's not relevant to you. So if you have an EIN number but not a taxpayer ID, that's fine. This would be, you know, your number, and this would be just 9s, so on and so forth for all these. You do have to designate a primary contact name for your organization, even if that person is not in the system as a user. We need to know who to contact about this project should any of the participants that are signed up be unavailable, okay? After you save that, it will submit a request to me. I'll approve the request, or I'll ask you more follow-up information about the request. But in this case, we're just going to give a sneak preview about if you've logged into the system. So at this point, you've been approved, you've got a username and a password. Once you log in, all right, by default, you're going to come to this home screen. This home screen is going to tell you your first name and what your role is in your organization, all right? The view available opportunities is where you'll find our grant applications for opportunities available right now. And here's the one for Co-op Program Grant 2021 for City of Arlington. I'm going to apply now, and that's going to take me directly to this forms menu. Now, one of the most common questions that I get is if I fill out a couple of these, right? So for example, some of these require me to put information in and some don't. The general information page is sort of a guidance document that lists different things you need to know about this. Say that I do this and gosh, I get pulled away to something else, right? And then I have to log back into the system later and then I'm stuck here. What do I do? Well, I don't need to click this again. If I've started a grant application, I scroll down to this area that says My Tasks, and it'll show me everything that I'm doing in the system. So if I click Open Tasks, here's my grant application. And that's how I get back to that forms menu to continue using it. It will appear in the task list until I submit it. Once I've submitted, I don't have an immediate task to do on that application. So the way that I would find an application that I've already submitted is by clicking the Applications tab and then searching either for a specific application that I've submitted, or if I leave it blank, it will show me every application that my organization has submitted in Argo 2020. Okay, now that was a little bit further down the rabbit hole than maybe I'd intended to go, but in my experience, what I've found is that those are the kind of common questions that we do get. So again, go in now, create the account for your sponsor organization, create your user account, set it up in the system, and at least start your application. And that way you can familiarize yourself with navigating the system, so that once you've got your resources put together and you're willing to and you're ready to submit it, that the technology is not a barrier to that process. So those are really all the questions that I have right now. If there are some questions in the chat that come up that I was unable to answer during this presentation, we'll be emailing you guys answers after the webinar at some point. We're able to download this transcript of questions and it has your email address and we can just email you directly. So at this point, I'm going to pass the the baton back to Carly, and she's going to continue to go through this presentation with you guys.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Blake. And I just wanted to address a couple of questions in the chat box. One was about if you had an account in the old system, our old Argo, if it would automatically transfer over to the new system. And the answer to that one is, unfortunately, it will not. And so if you had applied for a grant in the previous system, you will actually need to create a whole new account in the new system. And because there are so many accounts in the previous system, we didn't want to transfer all of those over if they weren't necessarily relevant. And so if you have not used the new system before, you will need to create a new account. And a few other questions. There's one question on if an archery class will be allowed. That will be allowed. And actually, we will have somebody from our archery program give a program overview later on. And so you'll get a little bit more information about that as well. 1 second here. There we go. And then one other question that's definitely relevant right now, and I want to preface this with saying we are going to be offering flexibility due to COVID. And so there is a lot of questions about with COVID happening right now, are we allowing virtual programs such as education trunks that would be given to teachers to use during their classes or other types of that type of programming? If it's directly related to COVID, and so if you are starting out your plan and it's because COVID, you cannot work directly with participants, we are allowing that type of virtual programs. With that, it's always best to contact me directly and talk about your virtual program because we are allowing those on a case-by-case basis. And so virtual programs that are, let's say, just a video that you put on your website that are open to the general public, and you may not have a way of gauging who has interacted with that or the demographics associated with those participants and so on. We're not typically allowing those types of virtual programs, but many of our programs have transitioned to virtual programming since we just cannot be working with participants right now. And so that is completely okay. But again, you may want to follow up with me to run your idea by me first before you apply, and I can tell you if that's something that would be allowed. Another question came up on what if you propose a particular project and then due to COVID, you cannot implement it as proposed. That is completely fine. And so I would say propose your project as you would like in a perfect world to implement it, but also talk about contingency plans within your application. So we do have a risk management section in the application and the narrative portion. And so you can talk about this is how we would like to run that program. However, if COVID is still an issue where you cannot work with participants, and at this rate, who knows what it's going to be like, you can talk about some other ways that you can engage your participants after the fact. And we will be flexible with you. We're going to work with you to amend your budget on whatever you need. But just know that we have we're offering full flexibility. A lot of our grants that were awarded in both 2019 and 2020 are going through that same issue. We're working with everybody on a case-by-case basis to make sure that the program changes that you're incorporating still align with the co-op grant, but also that we can still support your needs in this time. We don't want to hold that against you since all of this is just completely out of your control. So just know that we will definitely work with you, and virtual programs are allowed. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. And we're going to start going over the co-op grant application now. And if you have applied in either 2019 or earlier, this grant application is brand new and it really reflects our new scoring criteria that is now in place. And so our grant application has 6 primary sections, and I'll go through each one of these in detail. The first is our general information section. Then we have an applicant information section, which uses a lot of the general information from your user account. We have some general legal information sections. your project information and the project details, which those two are really the meat of your proposal. And then last but not least is the budget section. All right, so now I'm going to switch to a PDF of the application so I can walk through each of these with you. All right, so here is a PDF of what the application looks like. And normally I would walk through in our system, but sometimes our system can be a little bit slower. So for the ease of going through this PowerPoint presentation, I'm just going to go through our different PDF here. And so the first section is our general information, and this is more about going over the rules, some of the general information associated with it, the eligibility requirements that I had talked about earlier, which are also located in your program guidance section. And then it also has an overview of the timeline associated with it. So again, the deadline's November 6th at 5 p.m. All activities will need to be between March 1st, 2021 and September 1st, 2022. That's an 18-month period. My contact information, if you need to contact me. Again, if you have been working with Kathy Smith, our dear former grant manager, she has retired, so she's no longer with us, and so I'll be your primary contact for this application round. And if you need technical support, Blake Powers, who just gave an overview of the Recreation Grants Online system, he is our go-to guy, incredibly helpful. If you have any questions on creating an account, creating a user account, submitting the application or any of that technical, he is the right person to contact. And so he will receive emails through this general rec.grants email, or you can email him at blake.powers@tpwd.texas.gov. We are not accepting paper applications. Everything is going to be routed through this online system, so please keep that in mind. We have not accepted paper applications in quite a while now. Then the applicant information section. I'm not going to hit all of these because a lot of these are pretty self-explanatory, and some of these items will auto-populate from your user account, so just keep that in mind. You must check all of these boxes for the acknowledgements and the legal. Just know that those are general rules of our program. Again, a lot of this is pretty basic information, so I'm not going to go over it. There is a section for your SAM. Again, you must be in good standing with the System of Award Management, but if you do not have an account right now, don't worry about it. You do not need to create an account anymore. That's a change in our rules. If you do not have an account, you can just enter a bunch of 9s. You'll still be required to enter something there, but you can just enter 9s and we'll know that you don't have anything. We're still going to do a search for your organization, but you can just enter 9s. For your tax ID and EIN number, let's see, I've already passed that. Nope. There we go. You will have just one of those, and so you will not have both a tax ID and an EIN number. It really just depends on what type of organization you are, and so include whichever one is relevant for you, and then in the other one, it's still a required field, and again, you can just include a bunch of 9s in that line item just to kind of get through that particular section. You are also required to upload a resolution, and this must be signed and dated and include authorization to submit the application and include the primary contact for this grant project. If you do not include this resolution, that means you will not be eligible for grant funding, and we will not even review your application. And so this is going to be a really important document. This document must be signed by an authorized representative who has the power to submit an application for your agency. So again, look over this document multiple times because this is a common mistake, and it always hurts us whenever somebody forgot to do a signature or uploaded the wrong item or anything like that. So just really make sure that the correct item is included and includes all of the information listed. And then there's also an organizational capacity survey that you will be uploading. And there's a template here. You can just hand that off to your fiscal team. And that's really, that will not count against you in the application. It's used for our risk assessment purposes. But it's just a little bit more information about the internal processes within your agency. And it's what our auditors use for risk assessments. All right, and next we're going to head into the project description portion of the application. You'll do your project name and your project overview. Again, this is for the particular project that we're supporting, and this is going to be your elevator speech. So what would you tell people in 800 characters or less? And again, you can be really precise and you don't have to provide a whole lot here about a general overview of the project that you're applying for. And then SMART goals. We're going to ask you to provide 3 to 6 SMART goals in bullet point format that really summarize your particular grant program. And I'm going to switch back over to my presentation here so I can talk a little bit more about SMART goals. All right, so what are SMART goals? These are really your performance goals. Each grant talks about these slightly different. We decided to use a SMART goal format because a lot of people have worked with SMART goals before, and there's a lot of definition here. And so really this stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So you'll want to make sure that each SMART goal that you provide includes all of these aspects. We do not want you to include really general statements such as we're increasing knowledge and understanding of outdoors for participants. That doesn't include enough information. These SMART goals are going to be transfer over to your grant contract if you are awarded a grant. And so these are going to be the goals that we use to determine if you are successful or not. And so we want you to include very specific information. So include numerical goals. So how many participants are you including? We do not want you to provide up to language. So we don't want you to have something like up to, we're going to be serving up to 200 participants. You can have a range, so we're going to serve up to 150 to 200 participants, but we want it to be a little bit more specific than just up to 200, because that could mean that you serve 5 and you met your goals. And so we just want to make sure that it's a little bit more representative of your particular program. Attainable, again, this will be included in your grant agreement, so you really want to be realistic with what you're including in this proposal. That's something I'm going to stress throughout this entire application period, is to make sure that you're being reasonable and that realistic based on what you think you can complete. Always keep in mind COVID, propose what you want, but always think about that backup plan in case things just really don't work out. And then also include time bound. And so if these activities are going to be taking place in the spring, include that. Just try to include as many specifics as possible. And we're going to have a lot of examples for you so you can really see what we're talking about. But really, this SMART goals section should provide a good overview of your narrative and your entire project. So I should be able to read your SMART goal section and fully understand most aspects of what will be accomplished in this grant proposal. So here's a few examples of some SMART goals that we can include. So coordinate 5 weekend camping trips in the spring to Houston area state parks, connecting 100 low-income female participants from Houston ISD to natural resources in Texas. That includes specific numerical goals. I know exactly what you're doing in this grant project. You're doing camping trips. You're going to Houston area state parks. Even though you might not know specific parks, I know that the general region that you're going to be in. I know how many participants you're going to serve. I know the general timeline because it's going to be in spring, and I have a full understanding of what you're going to be completing. Another example is plant 75 trees at McKinney Falls State Park in November to educate 100 Boys and Girls Club youth on conservation principles. So again, I know exactly what you're going to be doing here. And always keep in mind with service projects that you're going to want permission from the site to do that service project. And so if you're doing a service project at McKinney Falls, like this one says, if you're going to be planting trees, they have very specific guidelines for how they manage their state parks. And so you may not have permission to allow to plant 75 trees on their site. So you want to make sure that you have all of those types of details figured out before you write this grant, because we want you to be specific. And again, if you include that you're going to have the service project in your grant, we're going to expect that you actually complete that component. I'm going to switch back to here. We do have a specific resource available, and this is found in the handout section of this webinar. It's also found in the resources section of Recreation Grants Online, and in the application there's a link to this guidance as well. But we have a 2-page SMART goal guidance which defines what SMART goals are, talks about why they're in place, and then gives a full page example of SMART goals. So take a look at this, go through these different SMART goals. If this is something exactly like you're gonna run, you can even steal this SMART goal and replace it with your particular numbers and locations and all of that. Again, you don't have to choose from this list, make it relevant to your program, but here's just some examples to help you out so that you can see what we're looking for. We do have a scoring criteria section on these SMART goals. And one thing we're making sure is that all of the different components are in the SMART goals and that they're consistent with the rest of the application. So if you include a SMART goal in this section, but then never talk about that type of activity in the narrative, that's going to bring up a lot of red flags for our grant reviewers. And so that's going to have a lot of questions, and you're most likely going to have some point deductions in the scoring. And if you're awarded a grant, we may even make you redo your SMART goals before we get a grant agreement in place. So it's really important that you take some time and make sure that these are relevant. And you can also give me a call or shoot me an email. I'm happy to walk through these with you to tell you if you're on the right track, and I can really support you in creating these SMART goals for your organization. Okay, so I'm going to go, let's see, back to the application here. The next section is your project narrative, and I will go back to my PowerPoint to talk about the items that are included in your project narrative. The project narrative section of the application is really the meat of your proposal. Most of the scoring elements are found in this project narrative section. So it's really important that you take some time, review your project narrative. You can have up to something like 20,000 characters for this. We hope that you don't include all of that information because we have a lot of grants to review, but we really want you to include all aspects and provide a really succinct explanation of your project at hand. And so in the particular application, we have included some of these bullet points of items that we would like you to talk about. And just make sure that this covers all aspects of your program. So I'll go through each one of these to talk about what we're really looking for here. So the population served, we want to know who you're targeting. Do you have participants already lined up? Do you have a partnership in place where you're going to get your participants? If you have different aspects to your program, so let's say you have a summer camp, but then you're also doing an after-school program and then also doing weekend camping trips, you're going to want to break it down per each of those 3 different components to talk about who the participants are for each type of those. So just keep that in mind. That's a really helpful tip when writing your application, is to maybe break it down in that matter. And it's really easy for us to get an understanding. Some people kind of jump around all over the place, and it can be really hard when reviewing the application to really know what you're proposing in the application. You're going to want to include when, where, and what activities. We like to say this whole section is the 5 W's, the who, what, when, where, why. And so make sure to include when, where, and what activities will be taking place throughout the grant activity. In the narrative, you will only include information for the particular project that you are requesting grant funding support for. And so if your organization is doing a bunch of different programs and activities, do not include them in this section. That only muddies the water a little bit. So just make sure to only talk about what activities that you're seeking grant funding for. Include the length of activities. So is this a 2-hour, a half day, a week long? Again, break this down per different type of activity. So if you're doing a summer camp program, talk about how this is a 5-day overnight summer camp. If you're doing an after-school program, talk about how this is an after-school program that meets 1 hour for the entire spring semester. So really break down into the details of that so we can understand the length of activities. That goes back to our scoring criteria, along with the next one about frequency the participants are engaged in, on the in-depth and likelihood to continue those types of activities. And so it goes back to our participant impact section of the scoring. This is where they're going to get a lot of that type of information. So frequency, is this a one-time project for your participants? How many are engaged in multiple aspects? So if you're doing several different camping trips, but some people attend multiple, some people attend one, talk about that. You can talk about how 90% roughly of your participants come one time, but about 10% of them might engage in 2, 3, 4 camping trips. This is probably one of the biggest challenges that projects have in their application is they don't really talk about the frequency that their participants are involved. So just keep that in mind. We also get to the risk management section in the training. Like I mentioned earlier, COVID is here. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, but it's hard to know, since the grant award will be on March 1, how we're still affected, but just keep in mind these potential issues. These are a lot of outdoor programs as well, so keep in mind that weather is an issue. So have a backup plan, have a contingency plan, and you can talk about that contingency plan in this application. But also keep in mind that something that's just completely out of your control, like COVID, we're going to work with you to figure out a plan moving forward. Talk about if you have a leadership development portion to your project. And so not all grantees are required to have a leadership development section to their application, and you're definitely not required. Many people still get grants if they do not have this. And the section's not necessarily just for careers either. It could be for leadership and for community leaders. This could include things like internships, counselor and training programs, talking about natural resource careers with your participants, so maybe having professionals coming out to talk about their careers, mentoring over time, advanced training, so maybe you're providing advanced training to participants who will then lead activities for other participants. Maybe you're sending your participants to do a Texas outdoor family training. And so that's a really advanced training with the expectation that they're going to go on and maybe lead other participants in doing those types of programs. This could also include having your participants do something like boater education, getting officially certified in boater education through our agency. So there's a lot of different opportunities here that aren't necessarily specific to careers. It could be leadership, but just make sure that it's natural resource related. And also make sure that it includes tangible steps to become natural resource relevant community leaders. And so it's not necessarily that you're just training people how to kayak, for example. It's really going a step beyond that and talking about how they can then become leaders in kayaking. Maybe that's what they're going to do in their career. Maybe they're going to go take out other people in the future and lead other groups in the future to do that type of activity. Or maybe they're going to be a really big champion for kayaking, and they're going to, have a huge presence to build the sport of kayaking. Just think about those types of things. And finally, outdoor service projects. Again, this is not a required component of your application. If you do not want to do a service project, we have many grants who do not include this component. And so you can still get awarded a grant without an outdoor service project. For some projects, the service project is their entire project application. So let's say their whole proposal is to do a full restoration of oyster reefs or something like that. So some people do have their entire application is a service project, and that is perfectly great. You're going to receive an excellent score in this particular section. You will receive higher scores in this section when participants are engaged in the planning, implementation, and evaluation. So is this a true service learning experience for the participants? Again, it has to be natural resource related, so you cannot be working at a food bank, let's say. You need to be planting trees or doing a restoration project, trash pickup, something like that that's more related to environmental issues. Also include how many participants were involved in this service project. So this needs to be fully developed, so you need to have somewhat of an idea of exactly what type of project you're going to do and where you're going to do this. Are participants going to be involved in just one service project? Or are they going to be involved in 3, 4? Talk about this. All right, so narrative and goal tips. So we've definitely learned a lot over time about what's helpful and what's not. And so we want to just provide you some tips and tricks. And so the biggest thing is to be clear and consistent. One of the biggest errors we definitely see in application is that they might include one component in, let's say, the narrative section, but not talk about it in the budget or timeline or SMART goal section of the application. So just make sure that all of those different components of the application are speaking to each other and that they're consistent. Plan conservatively, simplify the scope. Don't try to include way too many things in there and it's all over the place, because keep in mind that whatever you're proposed in the application, you are going to be required to do per your grant agreement. And so we understand some things happen where you might need to go slightly off. That's completely fine. But if you included like 4 different major components and you only end up completing one of those, that's going to be an issue in your grant agreement. So just plan conservatively, simplify the scope, be conservative in your participant numbers, and etc. Only include activities for this particular grant period. Again, this grant period goes from March 1 of 2021 to September 1 of 2022, that 18-month period. Any activities that fall outside of that 18-month period will be disallowed. So make sure that they do fall within that grant period. If you have multiple types of programming, like I said earlier, break it down per program type. So you can even format your narrative section to say, this is our summer camp program, and then give a couple paragraphs overview about who the participants are, what activities you're doing, the timeline, all of those details for that summer camp program. And then have a different header that says, this is my after school program, and then talk about all of those things for your after school program. So really just try to break it down in the most digestible way for our grant reviewers. And don't modify your program just to get points. This is a competitive grant program, and so keep that in mind. But we can really tell when organizations modify their scope just to get points for the grant. And I can tell you during the implementation phase, it's always so much more difficult, and it does not work out a lot of the time. And so be realistic for what your organization can do. If your organization has a specific plan and it does not include a service project, that is completely fine. Do not add a service project in there just to try to get a couple of extra points. That can cause a lot more headaches for you. So just be really true to the type of program that you would like to seek support for. This is one of the most important tips that I give other people, is have someone else review your application who does not know your program. They can read through your narrative and they can tell you if they understand what you're trying to do or if they don't. And so just make sure to have somebody else review it. We have a group of reviewers who are going to be reviewing all of our grant applications. And so they may not know anything about your program. And even if they do know something about your program, they cannot use that to benefit your application. So if you did not explain that program in your application, that will hurt against you. And so just have somebody review it, make sure it's easily digestible, and then go from there. And please use this narrative checklist to go through and make sure you have all of these different components to your grant application. It will really help, because if you're missing some of these, there might be some questions from our review committee, and you may get some points docked just because you forgot to talk about certain aspects of the program. So please just keep that in mind. We'll go through the direct relationship section to Parks and Wildlife, and then after that we'll take a break and I'll go through and answer any questions from the chat box. And so the next section of the application is your direct relationship to Parks and Wildlife. And remember, you're required to have at least one of these direct relationships. And so what does that mean? We're looking at having your participants either visit a Parks and Wildlife operated facility. So again, that can include a state park, a wildlife management area, fisheries, state natural areas, any of the sites that are owned and operated by Parks and Wildlife. That could also include integrating Parks and Wildlife education programs. And this is actually using our programs. And so we have several programs such as the NASP archery program, angler education, hunter education, boater education, Project Wild. We have several different programs, and you can see a full list of these programs in the document in the handout section called Co-op TPWD Programs and Sites. This will give a brief blurb of those programs and will also provide a link that you can click on that will bring you to that particular section of the application. Keep in mind that we want you to use TPWD's actual program. And so you could have your own just general angler education program, but we really want you to use the concepts from TPWD's angler education program, not just talking about general, angler education. And the third option here is participants working directly with Parks and Wildlife personnel. Keep in mind that this is personnel and not necessarily volunteers. And so these need to be paid by our agency. And so the participants will need to be directly involved with these. And so it could be you have a biologist come out and talk about your program. It could be that you're working with our Texas Outdoor Family Program and one of their rangers is giving you an interpretation and doing some training. You could be visiting a state park and having an interpreter do some training for your particular participants. And so those will all be eligible. And if you are working directly with our personnel, keep in mind that we're going to require you to have a commitment letter from that personnel. Our personnel are very, very busy. They have a lot on their plate. And so that's why we ask that if you are working directly with a Parks and Wildlife staff member, that you get a letter beforehand and attach it to this application. And this is more of a commitment letter, not a general letter of support. We want them to outline exactly what they're committing to do. And this is so that we make sure that you're just not Googling some names and putting them in your application. We want to make sure that you've actually formed those relationships and the staff member knows and has committed to partnering with your organization. In the scoring criteria, we are going to be looking at the quality of participant involvement in these sustained direct connections to Parks and Wildlife. So just keep that in mind, that a lot of the scoring, again, like I mentioned, is really focused on the quality and the impact to the participants themselves. We will be giving an overview of some of our education programs at the end of this PowerPoint. We do have Rob Owens, who's going to be talking about the archery program. And at the end of the application, they're going to be doing an overview. We also have a PowerPoint for some of the other programs in our education and outreach department as well. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I believe in 2019, our agency did some site transfers to Texas Historical Commission. And so these 6 sites here are no longer considered Parks and Wildlife sites, so they will not count towards this direct relationship. And so they have moved over to the Historical Commission, and they are no longer owned and operated by Parks and Wildlife. So that's not necessarily common knowledge for a lot of people, so we wanted to make sure to include that these 6 sites are no longer Parks and Wildlife facilities. All right, so with this, I'm going to jump over to the chat. Bear with me for just a minute, and I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that we have in this section. Okay, there's some sections that are really specific to organizations. And again, I will email you after this webinar to give you the answers that are really specific to your organization. So keep that in mind. Still include them in here or send me an email afterward, but I will email you directly trying to answer your questions. There is a question on if you can include payment to anyone employed by Parks and Wildlife. If you're trying to include payment for a staff member, unfortunately not, because that is our own agency. So you cannot include a staff member of somebody from our department as included with in this grant opportunity. So keep that in mind. But if this is completely out of their scope of the agency, and so this is a volunteer basis for that employee, and you want to include their mileage to get to the site to help you with programming, that would absolutely be allowed. So there is a question on if the grant can cover the time not directly with the campers and participants. So if it can include the time to do the activity planning, food shopping, absolutely. This grant will include the support, let's say for a program coordinator to do some of that planning, communication with partners, writing grant quarterly reports, working on the final report, submitting a reimbursement. All of those planning and coordination activities, as long as it's directly related to the proposed project, can be supported by this grant. So there's a question on if programming during the months of November to February would qualify for this grant. If it's for November of 2020 through February of 2021, unfortunately, that will not be covered. The activities must begin at the earliest on March 1 of 2020, or I'm sorry, March 1 of 2021, and go for an 18-month period after that. So it must fall within that eligible timeline. There is no minimum amount of engagement needed to score points, let's say, with a TPWD personnel member. So it completely varies depending on your project. So if you have a TPWD staff member coming out to do a 1-hour presentation with your participants, that would be eligible. If a staff member is working for 6 months with your participants, that would be eligible as well. They may receive more points for this section if it's a longer engagement, but there is no like eligible, not eligible for this particular part if it's depending on the length of time. There is a question on if we can help you connect you with TPWD personnel or suggest people to contact. Absolutely. That document that we have is a great start that will lead you to their particular website point. But if you, let's say, are looking for somebody in the Angler Education Department and you just have no idea who to contact, feel free to email me or give me a call. I can definitely make those connections for you beforehand. So if you have any question on a particular staff person that you're trying to find, just feel free to contact me and I'll do my best I can to connect you with that person. There's a question on if you have a hunting program on if you can hunt on private land and not necessarily in state parks. Absolutely. And so we support hunting. It doesn't necessarily have to take place in state parks. That goes for a lot of the different activities that we support in the grant program. So they don't have to take place in a state park. We do have some programs that have their own sites. And so they're working with participants on their site. Just keep in mind that you will still need some sort of connection to Parks and Wildlife. So for a hunting program, let's say, you might be using the hunter education curriculum. Or if you're doing field trips to your own site, maybe you're incorporating our Project Wild curriculum. Just make sure that connection is still there, but you can absolutely get support for programs that are not run on our particular site. Wildlife management areas that are operated and owned by TPWD will absolutely be counted as a TPWD facility. There is a question on if they can be retired TPWD personnel. For the sake of the personnel section and eligibility, they will need to be active paid personnel. And so if they're retired, they're considered more of a volunteer at that standpoint. So keep that in mind that they will not be considered a TPWD personnel at that point. All right, and some of the other questions are pretty specific, and again, I will get to you after the webinar to answer your very specific questions. All right, now I'm going to transfer back over to our application to review the last portions of the application. Now we're on to the proposed project details, and this is the timeline section. So again, keep in mind that all activities will take place between March 1st of 2021 through September 1st of 2022. Any activities before or after that will not be eligible. For this particular section, also keep in mind that special events are not allowed, so we cannot support any sort of Earth Days, festivals, competitions, or any other events that are open to the general public. Again, that goes back to not being able to collect the demographics for those who attend or not necessarily knowing who will show up the day of the event. You will be required to actually track these participants and the demographics that are listed on your grant agreement. You can include specific date ranges here, or you can be a little bit more general and include like a month or something like that. But try to be as specific as possible. We do see some people who just include tentative dates of the entire grant period, so March 1 through September 1. That's really not specific enough, and you will receive a point deduction because of that. We really want you to break it down to try to be as specific as possible. So if you're working with a school and it's an after-school program, you can do January through May of 2022. So you can include date ranges like that and a general location, and then include what type of activities are going to take place there. So is this an after-school program? Is this a boater education program? Something like that. If you have a program that's really, it happens repeatedly and you do the same sort of setup for each one of these programs. So an example would be, let's say you're doing field trips to your site or to a state park site, either one, but you're taking multiple classes. And so it's the same kind of setup. You have people coming out for 4 hours and you go through the same type of stations. We highly recommend including a program itinerary for what that general layout looks like. It really helps our grant reviewers know how long people are engaged, what types of activities are engaged, how in-depth people are engaged, and it's really helpful to better understand your project when there is an itinerary for repeat activities like that. If it's not a repeat program, you definitely don't need to. If you feel like having some sort of itinerary just for like a camping program or something like that, you absolutely can if you want to, but it's not required. All right, now we're going to move on to the participant section. Again, this is another important part of the application, which is worth about 30% of your application. So you're going to be required to include the total participants served through this program. And please keep in mind that this is an unduplicated amount. And what we mean by unduplicated is that participants may attend multiple events throughout the grant period, but you're only counting them one time. So if they attended multiple events, just include them once in this unduplicated account. Be conservative with this amount. This amount will transfer to your grant period if awarded. So if you're like in an ideal world would be to serve 300 participants to this program, but it's a little bit of a stretch, you may want to bring it down to like 250 participants. You may just want to be a little conservative because we will expect you to serve that amount. And then you'll also explain how you calculated this amount. So if you have multiple aspects, explain how many people will attend each aspect. So if you have an after-school program and a summer camp program, explain how many people will attend the summer camp and how many people will attend your after-school program. And next, we're going to move down to the demographic data. Again, like mentioned earlier, we have 4 different target demographics through this program that are listed here. You're going to be including the total number of the percent of total participants for that demographic. And please keep in mind that you will only receive points if you're serving 40% or more of that demographic. And so there is a range up to 6 points per demographic with a total of 24 points just for these target demographics. And so if you're serving 95% of people are female in your program, you will receive the full 6 points, and it's a range going from there. So if you serve 85, you might only receive 5 points, and so on. But you'll want to explain how you calculated this amount and the assurances that you will actually serve what you said you were going to serve. The best data to use for this section is past programming data if you've collected it. And so that is a really high assurances that you can serve that amount because you've collected that information and you know exactly how many, what percentage of those participants you've served in the past. So we always say that that is the best way to collect that data. Please keep in mind that you cannot use general census data. That's not allowed. So general city information, county information, zip codes, we want you to be more specific because just because you're targeting that specific zip code does not mean that that represents the participants who will actually be engaged in your program. If partnering is with a school, you can use their PEIMS data. This is their general demographic data for their school. But keep in mind that you must report on the actual percentage served and not report on the general estimate during the implementation phase. And so if you're serving an entire school or an entire class grade, you can use that general data. But if you're, let's say, cherry picking, so if you have an after-school program and people will just sign up who want to participate in your program, that's not enough assurances for their general school data because that may not be reflective of the school data. So you'll want to make sure that you have some sort of system to or method in place to collect that data for reporting purposes. Please give teachers a heads up about your data collection needs beforehand so that they know that they can provide you that information. We have heard that some schools are no longer able to give you the information, let's say for the particular class or for particular students. So just kind of keep that in mind. Make sure that you actually have the ability. And if the school can't provide you with that information, then you will need some sort of internal process to collect that information. And there's a few different ways you can do that. Some use partners who already collect that information, like Boys and Girls Clubs or schools. Some have a registration form that will also have that demographic information included. And then some people have a self-reporting survey. And so it all depends on your program. Self-reporting surveys is completely fine. You just need to make sure that you have a method of collecting that information, and that's what you're basing your reports. And just know that you'll be required to report on the actual served instead of just general estimates from the beginning. This section is extremely important as it's the basis in which co-op grants were created. And so that's why I know it's a lot of work to collect these demographic information, but that's why we really hone in on this. This is worth 30% of your grant scoring. So it really is important. If you do not have the means to collect for the information for a specific demographic, then put a 0. You do not have to serve all 4 of these demographics by any means. We have many grants who do not serve all of these demographics. They may only serve female, and that's their only demographic, and that is perfectly okay. Like I said earlier, there's up to 6 points awarded for each of these 4 categories. Very few of our projects receive points in all 4 of these categories. And if you serve less than 40%, then you can just put a 0 because you're not going to receive any points and it will not transfer over to your grant contract. But just keep in mind, again, be very realistic in this section. So if you, let's say low income is a very common one. If you do not have the means or if you do not feel comfortable asking your participants for this low income information, then by all means just put a 0 because again, you will be required to report this. And if you do not meet your numbers, you will have a score and deduction for future grants. And so please just keep that in mind. A few other things that we like to say is for low income, we often use the free and reduced lunch schedule with schools. If you have a separate way of knowing low income, then that's okay. Just please explain of how you calculated that and what you're using. Also, for individuals with physical or mental disabilities, we have a little bit of a broad interpretation here. So that could mean ADD, dyslexia, a whole range of different disabilities and challenges there. So, you know, we have a broad spectrum in that range. So if you have any questions at all about what counts or how to calculate or anything like that related to demographics, I highly encourage you to reach out and ask me for clarification, and I can help you walk you through this section. You will not be required to provide us with your specific roster for participants during the implementation phase. However, you must have this information internally because if you're questioned at all or occasionally our programs go through an audit process, you will be required to provide us with your backup documentation. But when you're doing your quarterly reports, you do not need to provide us with your daily rosters. You'll just provide us with the total amount served and the particular percentage for each one of these demographics that you're required to serve. The other sections for demographics are pretty self-explanatory. We're wanting to make sure that you have, we want to know how you will collect and track the demographic information for these participants, and also how you'll recruit for these participants. So go ahead and include that information here. If you have particular partners where you're going to get your participants from, so let's say you're working with the Boys and Girls program, feel free to include a commitment letter from that organization saying that they will provide participants. It's not required, but it's recommended because that will help you towards the assurances. So if we see those letters, we're like, okay, they do have that in place. They're most likely will serve this organization and they have the participants. They know exactly who they will serve. So feel free to include that upload letter here. All right, I'm gonna break briefly to go over the chat section again and try to answer some of these questions. So there's a question on if you're using a TPWD Parks, if you're allowed to purchase a park entrance pass, or will they waive the entrance fee and the activity fee? You can absolutely pay for entrance fees. I know it seems strange that you're receiving a grant and we're giving you money that will then be paid back to our agency, but that is completely fine. And so if you are visiting a park with all of your participants, you can absolutely include the entrance fees. Some of our programs even will purchase like a youth pass for their organization to take out all their participants. That is completely fine. The one thing we do not allow is for you to, let's say, purchase an annual parks pass for a particular individual for them to use on their own time. That's not allowed. It needs to stay within the program. So your organization would need to be the holder of that annual parks pass. So there is a question on if you're starting this program with this grant, how would you estimate the demographic participants? And that can be a tricky one. And that's often where some people do struggle. If this is a new program, you're not entirely sure how to estimate these demographics because you have not collected that in the past. It depends for each particular organization here, but one thing that's really helpful in this particular section is if maybe you have partnerships in place. So if you are partnering with an organization who's providing participants, maybe they have collected these, or maybe you have a different way of collecting this information. You'll just want to have some sort of recollection or way of estimating who these, what demographics that you would be serving. So again, I can work with you on a case-by-case basis to help you out with your particular situation to figure out what potential options could be available. If you're serving a school, there's a question on low income and how you determine low income. Again, we use the free and reduced lunch schedule for schools, but if there's a different way that you use to calculate low income, so if you use, let's say, local averages or national averages for low income, that's completely fine as well. Just make sure to explain how you arrived at that amount. But again, if you're only serving a couple students from that school, we do not want you to use the general school data because that may not be reflective of the students that you're actually serving. If you're serving a whole class or a whole school, you can absolutely use those amounts. But if you're serving, 5, 10 students from there, you need to have some other means of collecting that information. And if you do not have the ability to collect, let's say, low income information, then you can just not include that in your application. You can include what other demographics you actually know or have the ability to collect. So if you do serve all 4 categories of our demographics and you serve 100% of all 4 of those categories, you will get the full points. And so it is a breakout section of, one participant may fall in multiple categories. You may have one low income participant who's also a female, and so that would count in both categories. So please keep that in mind. There's a question on if fees for hunting programs would be covered in grants. It depends on, I'm not sure exactly what fees you're asking, but that's something where I can talk to you on a case-by-case basis to figure out exactly what type of fees. But if it's something like a fishing license or a hunting license, that can be allowed. We can allow group fishing licenses and all of that. Hunting leases will not be allowed through this program. So just keep that in mind that we cannot allow. Those can be incredibly expensive and may not necessarily be reflective of the participants that are going on your particular event. So we cannot support hunting leases. There's a question on if the person must be named when collecting the data. They do not need to be. So it could be a general roster that you keep internally. And again, you do not need to submit that to us, but must have it internally in case you're ever audited. But it could just be a participant roster that says participant number 1, participant number 2, and so on. You do not need to have specific names listed. That's personal information. We do not want that information. We do not want to make any of that public or give that to anybody else. So you do not need to list their names. You will need estimated numbers before you submit the grant application. We do not like numbers that are, we hope to serve this amount. It really does need to be based on some sort of data, however that is. And again, it's different for each organization. But we need you to really hone in on how you calculated that number or estimated. Some people have, we hope to serve this amount, but they have no idea if they can serve that amount. And so that can be really difficult. And in many, many cases, they don't end up serving that amount because the program didn't really, their recruitment didn't go as planned. And so you do need some sort of more honed in, defined way of knowing exactly who you're going to serve. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the final portion of our grant, and then after that we're going to have an overview of some of our programs, and then we may actually finish up a little bit early and answer some of your questions. So next up is the budget section. All right, so our budget form, if you've applied in the past, may look slightly different. And so here's a PDF of what the budget form looks like. I did not load it into the system because please keep in mind that the budget form specifically can be a little bit slower. And so I didn't want it to slow down things during this presentation. But this is generally how the budget will look. You'll have all of those different sections like personnel and fringe, food and travel, fees and liability insurance, supplies, service project. Those will all be broken out into these different sections, and then you'll include your expenses here. You'll have far more lines available here than the 3 that are showing. This is just for PDF purposes. But basically, you will include for each section what item you're listing here, and then the number of units and the cost per unit. So if you have a program coordinator, you can have program coordinator, program manager, intern, all of those listed separately, and then include number of units. You can do this a couple different ways. If you know the number of hours times their base hourly rate, you can include it that way, or you can do it a percentage of their salary time. So if you know this particular staff member will be 25% of their time will be allocated towards their grant, you can include 25% of their salary here, and their annual salary amount would be listed in the cost per unit, and then it'd be 25% in the number of units. That amount will automatically calculate the total cost column. So please keep that in mind. Whatever you put in the number of units and the cost per unit section will auto calculate for the total cost line. One thing that's a little bit tricky in this section is that you will need to insert the amounts for the grantee cost and the TPWD cost yourself. And so the grantee cost is what we've called sponsor contribution in the past. You are not required to do any sort of sponsor contribution. In fact, that's one of the major changes we made for this year, is that there are no longer any points tied to sponsor contribution, and so you will not get any points tied for that. You can absolutely include those amounts here just so that we can see you've thought about that item, and you've included that in your planning discussion, and we know that you have that budgeted yourself. But you will not be required to provide any sort of backup documentation or to have a certain, you will not be required to have a certain amount of sponsor contribution if you're awarded a grant. We've completely removed that from the grant. The TPWD cost is the amount that you would like for this grant purposes. So if you would like to request $5,000 in personnel, that is what you will include in TPD cost. And so the biggest thing that you'll need to make sure is that the grantee cost, so that sponsor contribution, plus the TPWD cost adds up to the total cost column. If you have an error in there and it does not add up, you'll actually receive an error in the budget and you cannot submit your budget and your proposal. That must have all the errors. And if you do receive an error after you hit save, a little red error notice will come up at the top that tells you that those two line items do not equal the total cost. And so it'll tell you exactly which section. So either the personnel section or the supplies section, that something is wrong in there. Due to these error checks, this section does take longer. So please account for this in your time management. We highly recommend not starting the budget section 30 minutes before the application deadline because it can take a while. And so you really need to budget that, work on it as soon as possible, and just know that things take a little bit longer. If you have a lot of different line items in this section, it can take a while to save your budget. And we do recommend saving your budget often so that you do not lose data because it can time out after a while. But it could take up to a minute or so for it to save properly. And so do not refresh during that time, just hit save and wait for it to completely save. Projects with a lot of data in this section, it can take a little while for it to load. Pages 10 through 13 in your program guidance do include all of the allowed and disallowed expenses for this grant. So it's really important that you look over all of those expenses and make sure that all the items that you're including in the TPWD cost column are allowed expenses. If you do by chance include some sort of expense that's not allowed here, so let's say you put in something with a motor, so you included a generator or something like that, we will remove that from your budget and you will not have the opportunity to replace that cost with another allowed expense. We will just deduct that amount from your award amount and you cannot get that amount added back on later. So just keep in mind, it's really important to look to make sure that these expenses are allowable. If you have any question on if specific expenses are allowable, feel free to either give me a call or shoot me an email. I cannot review your budget and give you an evaluation on your proposed budget just because that's a conflict of interest and that can give you an advantage in here. But if you have questions about specific line items, feel free to ask me if that line item is eligible or not. I'm happy to do that for you. Again, a reminder that we have removed the 40% cap for personnel. So you can request more than 40% of your total grant award for personnel now. We want to make sure that we give you all the things that you need, and personnel is absolutely one of those items. But make sure that all personnel listed are directly related to the project at hand, and that all personnel listed for reimbursement are included in the key personnel section of the application. At the beginning of the application, there's a section where you list all your key personnel. We're going to look at it very strangely if you have a bunch of personnel listed that you're seeking reimbursement for. However, they're not included in your key personnel. So just make sure that those two things kind of match. Also keep in mind that if you have personnel listed here, you will be required to have timesheets for those personnel for your salary and hourly employees. So some organizations don't have timesheets. If you are awarded a grant and you're seeking reimbursement, you will be required to submit timesheets. So we have some templates that we can provide you, but just keep in mind that that is something that you'll be required to do. For the food and travel section, again, you can include mileage here. We do use the federal mileage rate, so keep that in mind when doing your calculating. You can just Google the federal mileage rate and it'll give you the current amount, or if you don't feel comfortable with that, you can email me and I can tell you what the federal mileage rate is right now. For fees and liability, you cannot pay fees to yourself. And so if you typically charge, let's say $50 to run your program, you cannot include in the fee section just 20 different units at $50 a cost that would be paid to your organization. We cannot allow that. And the reason being is that that might include some indirect expenses, which are not allowed with the co-op grant. And so we would rather fund those expenses that we know. So we want to support you with those actual expenses to run the program. So those supplies, those personnel, all of that. So you are not allowed to put general fees here that would be paid to yourself. The same with like a scholarship. You cannot just include 50 scholarships here that would be paid to yourself. That would not be allowed. For liability insurance, again, you cannot include D&O insurance, vehicle insurance, or property insurance. It must be participant liability insurance. And then in the supply section, some people do this many different ways. Some people include all of the individual line items for these supplies, but some people also will include general line items like kayak supplies and related, or rock climbing supplies. That is perfectly fine and actually offers a little bit more flexibility when it comes to submitting a reimbursement, so that you don't have to keep doing amendments to add in, let's say if you included harnesses, but you did not include carabiners. A general line item like rock climbing supplies would cover all of those things. So it's a little bit easier that way. If you do general items like kayaking supplies or rock climbing supplies, just make sure in the bottom section, the budget summary section, you explain what type of items are included in there. The other thing I want to mention about those general line items is that we do not allow you to use a really, really general line item such as program supplies or event supplies or education supplies. That's really just not specific enough because we don't know what's included in there. There could be a bunch of items included in education supplies that are not necessarily allowed. So you may have arts and craft items that are not allowed. And so that's why we want it to be a little bit more specific than just program supplies. You will need to break it out a little bit further than that. Also in the program summary section below, if there's anything else that you need to explain the budget section of your organization, you can include that in the budget summary section. So if you want to tell us that you have somebody else who is who's donating all the kayaks to run your program, that's great. You can include that in the budget summary section. Once you've fully completed this budget, just make sure that all of the costs you would like to be supported through the grant are under the TPWD cost line item and not under the grantee cost. The grantee cost is something that you will be supplying yourself, and all of the expenses awarded that you would like to receive from our agency must be under the TPWD cost column. And that both the grantee cost and the TPWD cost add up to the total cost column. At the bottom, the total project cost will auto-calculate for just the items in the TPWD cost, and that will be included for the total grant funds requested will show there. Again, these items must be between $5,000 and $30,000. If it's over, our application is smart enough to where it will not actually allow you to submit the application. It will give you an error. So if you include grant funds for $35,000, it will give you an error and you are not able to submit your application for this grant. So keep that in mind, look at the total grant funds requested and make sure that that's the correct amount. Again, like I mentioned earlier, this page will take a long time to load, especially if you have a lot of items, so please be patient. Save often, it will time out. At the top here, we do have a link to our program guidance document as well, which is found in the resources section. In the resources section of Argo, we also have a sample budget for you. So if you're curious what other budgets might look like, there's a sample. We also have a template available. So if you wanted to work completely offline and fill in these items on a template, we have that available, and things will auto-calculate for you. It's a smart spreadsheet. And so we often recommend that just because things can time out in the system, and sometimes it's just easier to work offline. So that is available in the resources section of the application. So that is all I have for the budget section. I'll go back to the chat box to see if there's any specific budget related questions that I can answer. And again, if it's specific to your program, I'll contact you after the fact, but I'll try to answer some of the more general questions. So bear with me for a minute. This is not a match grant. That is a question. This is not match. There's no match required. So if you have grant costs and you're only seeking reimbursement for $30,000 of cost, and that's all that you're included in this budget, that's great. There's no match requirement for this. Yes, the total cost column is the grantee cost plus the TPWD cost, but it does not add up that way. So the number of units and the cost per unit will auto-calculate to fill the total cost column. But you will need to separately include your individual, what will fall under the grantee cost and the TPWD cost. So for instance, if you have 5 units at $100 per unit, that will be $500 in the total cost. But if your organization would like to cover 100 of those dollars, and then you're seeking a request for 400 from our agency through the grant, then you will put $100 in the grantee cost column and $400 in the TPWD cost column. So that's how you'll manage the budget. You do not have to have names of the key personnel. You could just include their titles. That's completely fine. We know that there's a lot of turnover in agencies of all kinds, and so you can include just the title. We will support transportation such as bus rental to get to a state park. That is absolutely an allowable expense. So if you need to rent a van or rent a bus, anything like that will absolutely be covered under this grant. Hand tools for invasive species removal will be allowable as well. So if you need some pickaxes or other shovels, anything like that to do invasive species removal, you can absolutely include those in the expenses. Bird field guides books are absolutely allowable as well. Make sure that any sort of books remain with your program, but if you have some sort of guide, that can be given to participants as well. You can purchase an equipment trailer. It does not have to be a set amount. The one thing to keep in mind for equipment, and this goes for any sort of equipment, is that if the individual cost for that item is $5,000 or more, there will be additional tracking requirements for that item. And so we often run into this with trailers. And so if you have a trailer that's less than $5,000, don't even worry about it. There's not any additional tracking. That's completely fine. But if you have a trailer that's over $5,000, and many covered trailers are over $5,000, keep in mind that there will be additional reporting requirements that will go after the grant period ends. So it becomes a capital purchase after that point. And so just keep that in mind. And what we're also looking for is reasonability. And so if you are requesting a $25,000 trailer with a full bathroom and everything, it may not be considered reasonable from our auditor's perspective. If you have any questions on specific things, that's completely fine. We do have some people who have like a $10,000 trailer listed because they need a larger trailer that will hold all of their supplies to take to the different events. That's fine. But if you start getting into really, really expensive trailers, you may want to run that by us to see if our auditors would consider that reasonable. There's a question on if you can reimburse volunteer personnel for costs and expenses of mentoring to participants, it depends on what costs those are. So since these are volunteers, they will not have a specific personnel costs like an hourly rate or anything. But if they're purchasing supplies that are already listed on your approved budget, then the agency themselves will need to reimburse the volunteer, and then we will reimburse the agency. So those, if those expenses are directly related to the program and listed on the budget, we can provide reimbursement for those expenses. There's a question on if firearm and ammunition costs are allowed for hunting programs. Absolutely. Again, we want to provide you with the items that you need to implement your program. And so if you have a hunting program and you need to include firearms and all of the ammo that come along with it, all of those scopes, you can absolutely include those items on your grant budget. Those are considered allowable expenses. All right, so that wraps up the budget. I have a couple of last minute things to go over on my PowerPoint, which I will show you now. And then we will leave it up to questions and have our general programs give you an overview. So bear with me. I want to review the timeline just one more time. Applications are currently open. The application deadline is November 6th of 2020. Grant awards will be announced on March 1st of 2021. Whether you receive a grant or not, you will receive a notification via email through our Recreation Grants Online system. And so if you have an account in there, you will receive those notifications. Again, we give you an announcement whether you got the grant or whether you did not get the grant. So both of those. But that will happen on March 1st of 2020. Typically first thing in the morning, we send those out. If you're awarded a grant, you will attend a grant management workshop in late March. You can include the expenses to attend that, but I will tell you, with COVID and all of that happening right now, there's a high probability that this grant management workshop will not be in person. It will probably be a webinar or a series of recorded grant modules. And so you will not need to include the cost for driving to Austin for that workshop. There's a 95% chance we're still going to be online at that point, and that we would do this via a webinar. So I wanted to give you a heads up about that. And again, all expenses and activities must be incurred between the award agreement period. So between March 1st, 2021 and September 1st, 2022, you cannot purchase expenses now and then seek reimbursement later. If you get a grant, they have to be purchased after March 1st. And same with activities, they have to take place during that time. So please keep that in mind. Training and resources. This webinar is absolutely recorded and will be available in the Recreation Grants Online system in the resources section. If you have any question on how to access that, feel free to shoot me an email and I can send you the link. It might take us a day or two to get that up there, but we will absolutely get that webinar uploaded once this is completely finished. We do have a series of Argo 2020 training videos and guides that Blake went over. And so if you have questions on how to create an account or how to submit your application and so on, just some of those general guidance for the system itself, we do have some training videos. Again, Blake, our systems administrator, is available to offer any guidance as well if you need any help with that. We also have a program and technical guidance. I'm always here. We are not one of those grant programs who's like, please don't contact me. We encourage you to contact and reach out. We want your grant application to be successful. And so we want to give you all the tools and all of the information beforehand. That's why it's really important to reach out to see if you have any questions before so that points are not deducted in your application. So again, feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. A few last tips: consistent. That's the biggest issue that we have with our grants, is the inconsistencies in their grant application. So make sure to keep a close eye on that. Plan conservatively, make sure that you will actually be able to implement your project as proposed. Don't just try to get points. Be true to what program you would actually like to implement with your participants. Have someone else review your application to make sure that it's fully understandable. Somebody that preferably does not know your program, they can tell you if it really makes sense of what you're writing in the application. And start early. You have until November 6th at 5 p.m. This is a little bit of a longer application, we know that, so that's why we ask you to start early and reach out to us if you have any questions at all. Here's my contact information if you have any questions. Again, this is near the end of the webinar. We're going to go ahead and have some of our Parks and Wildlife staff give you an overview of some of our education programs that we offer through the agency. So we're going to have them give an overview now, and then I'll come back afterwards to answer any last minute questions that you have in the chat. So I do want to include a couple more reminders before I shoot it over to Rob. But when you're done with your application, make sure to hover over the status change link and click submit option, and that will actually submit your application. You should receive a confirmation error or a confirmation email to confirm that you submitted your application. If you don't, feel free to reach out to me and I can tell you if it came through. We recommend reaching out just to confirm that the application was received. If you are not awarded a grant, please don't be discouraged. It's not a reflection on your program at all. We receive far more applications each year than we can fund annually. And especially with the decrease to funding amounts available for this year, we think it's going to be a pretty competitive year. So please don't take it personally. Don't get discouraged. We do not offer partially funded grants. And so for whoever scores the highest, we fund their entire grant, and then we go down the list scoring all of their requests until we run out of money. And so we do give you the full amount until we run out of money. And so just keep that in mind. That's how we typically score and award our applications. If not funded a grant, you can request a critique to see how you scored. Once it's critiqued, we're happy to review that application with you to tell you how you can be more competitive in future years. And so that's something we want to be really transparent, and we want to help you out. So many of our grantees do not get a grant in their first year, but after they get an application critique, then they have made some changes to their application and they come back the following year and they can resubmit and are often awarded a grant. So please don't be discouraged. Try again next year. This will be a very competitive year, so we encourage you to keep at it. Hopefully we'll have more funding in the following year as well. And so with that, we are going to pass over the presentation to Rob Owen with our archery program, who's going to give you a general overview of the archery program. So Rob, at this point, we're going to be passing it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Carly. So what do I do for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department? Let's see, bring up my screen here and share this with you. Okay. All right, very good. I believe you can see my screen now. So I'm Robert Owen. I'm the Outreach and Recruitment Manager for Texas Parks and Wildlife. So what is it that I do from TPWD? I coordinate large signature outreach events like TPWD's part in the state fair, but I also manage a couple of archery programs, train the trainer archery programs. So let me see here. Okay, so those two programs are the National Archery in the Schools program, as well as TPWD's partnership with the USA Archery program. And they're similar in their design, but they are different in the audiences that they serve. National Archery in the Schools program may give itself away by its name, but it's mostly designed for an in-school audience. A coach or a teacher becomes certified in the basic archery instructor content, and then they deliver lessons within school, whether those work within the social studies or history or sciences with trajectory and velocity. or phys ed. That's up to the school to manage how they fit into their teaks and needs. But one thing about NASP is that it's primarily an indoor program. The archery range is set up inside to take away those elements of variability, wind and things like that, because eventually, and we'll get into it in a moment, the idea is to be a competitive archer based on your accuracy and things like that. So there are presently 1,500 schools participating in NASP. So if you're not one of those schools, we'd love for you to join the ranks of participation. And we understand that things change from year to year, whether it's budget or staffing and these sorts of things. So as much as that number varies, it's a big program and we'd welcome you to join in. How the USA Archery partnership is a little bit different is that this is more designed for rec centers, parks and rec departments, nonprofits, clubs, and that sort of thing. It is indoor and outdoor flexible. And as you see in the image at the bottom of the page, an archery range can very much be outdoors, and it is mobile. That range you're looking at there is not a static range that's up year round. Instead, they put it up when they need it and they take it down when they don't. So don't let your individual facilities at your location impact your consideration of archery being applicable to your audience. What are the benefits of archery? Well, there's always the exercise, obviously, getting the blood moving, walking up and down the range. You'll eventually put some miles on retrieving your arrows, and also you're just getting the blood moving a little bit. There's a little bit of adrenaline that gets pumping when out there on the range and shooting for that bullseye. Beyond the physical benefits, there's therapeutic benefits too. Becoming a quality archer requires, some focus and determination and practice and problem solving. Why does my arrow keep drifting and missing the bullseye high and left? Well, let's work it out. Let's deal with that and make some changes on our shooting process. So there's a lot of life skill in archery that we hope translates into people's lives outside of the archery range. Additionally, it's accessible to anyone. All of these programs, you might be imagining a large compound bow that you've seen in hunting displays or presentations. This equipment is very much designed for the beginner. So a youth can easily pull back one of these bows and be active on the shooting line. And this is especially cool when you get families together, because there's not too many sports out there where a 10-year-old can be just as competitive in the sport as an adult and who's had maybe a different anatomical strengths in these sorts of things. So it's really great to see the competitive spirit that comes out in archery as well. Also, we're always hoping that the skill translates to outdoor hobbies. Maybe these folks become a hunter in future incarnations of their archery skills. And I talked about that archery range being put up and take downable. I say that because it's very mobile. It can be feasibly used for outreach too. If the range traveled with you to an event in your community, you could very easily see the line for participating on the range grow to fill up the ranks or registration for your next summer camp.
Rob, this is Blake. Your slide is not advancing. It's been on the first slide the whole presentation. There's a couple folks in the question, so
oh my goodness,
up on that.
Sure. Let's see. Let's see. How are we doing now? Oh. Let's see. Is that the one, Blake?
Yes, there you go. Benefits of sharing archery skills is what we're seeing now.
Beautiful. My apologies, everyone. Let's see. To back up, there's that archery range I was discussing how we can put it up and take it down. It's visible there at the bottom of the screen and very mobile. Okay, so that range can travel with you to someplace in set it up with all safety considerations in mind and surrounding audiences and things, and you'll see the line build of people who want to participate in the activities you're offering. And additional benefits of NASP, there is a statewide tournament each year in Belton, Texas. This year, obviously, it was canceled due to COVID, unfortunately, but we are anticipating 3,000 archers to come from around Texas to compete in the tournament. And winners at that tournament are then invited to national tournament. And with that local win, there are scholarships available to winners, scholarships available to winners and greater scholarships available at the national level too. And don't forget that NASP aligned curriculum with the TEKS standards of science, social studies, and phys ed. Okay, what does a partnership with us look like? Well, training in action in the top left-hand corner of the screen there, that video, that's Bernie Kessner, our NASP aficionado, leading a training. And they are COVID responsible, 10 or fewer participants, PPE worn, and we don't share equipment between participants either. On the top right-hand corner, you see a video. This is our NASP tournament in Belton, Texas. But this is a demonstration of what a range can look like and participation can look like from your organization, wherever you want to host it. And again, these trainings and partnerships are very much based in safety. That is a majority of our training, is setting up a range safely, and the processes involved in making sure that no incidences happen. You may be wondering about safety since I've brought up archery and thinking about arrows flying through the air. Well, here's some great statistics that we hope help reinforce the safety messaging of a properly run archery range. 8.44 million participants in archery skills through NASP in 2014. And you'll notice that that number has steadily been increasing, but the linear number, that red line, actually shows that the number of incidences per 1,000 shooters is actually going down. So participants going up, incidences going down. We like that. The bottom graph shows how archery sports are actually safer than golf in terms of those hosted with school-aged audiences. So bowling has its beat a little bit, but archery can be safer than golf, basketball, soccer, baseball. It's pretty impressive how safe an archery range can be when done properly. For anybody who's been through the for anybody who's been certified with USA Archery or NASP, it does open an additional curriculum set called Explore Bow Hunting and Explore Bow Fishing. This is a separate training, separate little bit of equipment, but it is very much intended to help audiences feel comfortable with the hunting sports and the skills required to participate in those. So the video here is showing a small class participating in an activity that demonstrates wind and scent in the field. And the curriculum book helps walk you through plenty of activities to host with your audiences to help them feel more comfortable with future opportunities to hunt and bowfish. And a lot of it is equipment designed too, because equipment unfamiliarity is a significant barrier for audiences. So try to knock down those barriers to create future conservationists. All right, everyone. Try to keep it short and sweet. My apologies for the missed couple of slides at the beginning. Here's my contact information. If anyone would like to follow up to gather more information, I'm happy to provide it. Thanks again to Blake and Carly for the invitation, and take care, everyone.
Thank you so much, Rob. And Rob and his team are absolutely wonderful. So if you are doing archery and need any assistance at all, they are definitely happy and there to help. And so with that, we are also going to do a short presentation on some of the other programs within the agency. And I also wanted to preface, if you don't have any questions, or if you already know our programs within the agency and feel really good, there's not going to be anything else after this except answering some questions in the chat. So feel free to log off if you want, but we do have some additional information for our education and outreach programs. So with that, I will turn it over to Blake for the education and outreach presentation.
This presentation will have some embedded audio, everyone. So if there's any issue with hearing the audio out of the presentation, just let us know. I'm going to go ahead and start it from the first slide, and it'll take me just a moment to share my screen properly. So you'll hear a little sound, and then we'll run it back, and then once it starts playing, I'll actually catch up that sound that was playing from the beginning. So just one moment.
Good day. I'm Johnny Smith from Outreach and Education at Texas Parks and Wildlife. And I'm so thrilled to present you today with information about our group and all of the various programming and training that we offer. I'm going to start out with an overview of Outreach and Education. These are the areas that we are concentrated in. Aquatic education, that is our angler collection of programs, boater education, conservation education, hunter education, and outreach and recruitment. Through all of these programs, we follow the train the trainer model. You see, we cover the entire state in each of these 5 areas with a total staff of 26 or 27 individuals. So without trained volunteers, certified instructors in each of these areas, we would not be able to cover the state as effectively as we do and provide the optional and mandatory trainings the state of Texas requires. Aquatic education gives you the opportunity to learn to fish from local experts. Whether you know a lot or a little about fishing, we can equip you for greater success and to teach others how to do the same. Once you're trained, you are part of a large network that spans across the entire state. This is a picture of one recent class in San Antonio where each of these individuals were trained to become angler education instructors. We find that this is a win-win proposition. We win because we're able to introduce new participants into the outdoors. The participants win because we give them a new capacity to enjoy the outdoors themselves and to introduce others to the same. In FY19, our angler education program operated with about 600 active volunteers, and we conducted fishing classes and outreach events for nearly 70,000 people. About 45,000 of those were youth, and about 20,000 or so were adults. In addition, staff and area chiefs conducted 62 different instructor workshops attended by over 700 participants. This vast volunteer network is available to you to assist with your fishing classes and events. Our offerings run the gamut from a very basic angler training to advanced. We also do outreach programs. We have beginning and intermediate fly fishing programs. In addition to outreach, we also offer specialty clinics, a variety of those. It's possible that we have a clinic in an area of your interest. And we then also train instructors in regular angling and in fly fishing. Our boater education program runs a little over 300 active volunteers, and the state of Texas requires boat operators to be trained in boating safety. Those 300 active volunteers conducted training to certify about 25,000 participants in fiscal year 19. We see water safety as paramount to enjoying the outdoors safely, especially for kids with little or no experience in open water or with watercraft. Our conservation education program focuses primarily on two areas: the Project Wild suite of curriculum, which I'll talk more about in just a moment, and the Texas Aquatic Science curriculum. Project Wild, as I mentioned, is a suite of programs that are aimed at terrestrial and aquatic wildlife and habitats, and gives people an opportunity to learn more about them in depth. Project Wild is aimed at K through 12 students and is a school-based curriculum, but can be easily used outside of formal learning settings. Project Wild focuses on terrestrial instruction and activities. Aquatic Wild focuses on those aquatic habitats and the species that call them home. And then lastly, Growing Up Wild is centered on ages 3 through 7, so that even preschool aged children can start learning about wildlife and habitats around them. Project Wild has a unique emphasis in that it also gives kids a reason to learn more about wildlife and the habitats that support them, because there are many careers that are aimed at this knowledge base. You may think about wildlife biology or fisheries science, but there are many, many other careers where an understanding, working knowledge of wildlife and habitats is critical. Texas Aquatic Science is a grade 6 through 12 school-based curriculum that is Texas-centric. There are textbooks available through A&M Press, as well as a free online student web portal that contains the same content as the textbook, in addition to a well fleshed out set of videos and graphics that are not available through the textbook option. In addition to this, we wanted to be able to connect learners with opportunities to see their learning in action in the field. And so there are 42 certified field sites around the state of Texas that present real quality field trip opportunities for people learning about aquatic science. Those sites, many of them are equipped with a full set of aquatic science trunks with all of the equipment, nets, testing materials, and equipment needed in order to learn more about aquatic habitats and their wildlife. Our hunter education program is focused primarily on introducing participants to safe, ethical hunting opportunities, to be able to enjoy the outdoors and do it in a safe way. That is our mantra: to teach safe, responsible, knowledgeable, and involved hunting shooting practices. We're very proud of the safety record of hunting in the state of Texas. These two graphs show you that over the years, as we have trained more and more hunter education graduates, that the number of incidents and fatalities per 100,000 hunters has steadily dropped, making hunting one of the safest outdoor activities one can be involved in. We also work with a variety of different partners who offer mentored hunt experiences, and we can connect you with them and with their training opportunities. In addition to that, we work with a variety of partners to put on other offerings, like Becoming an Outdoor Woman, Student Air Riflery Program, Bow Hunter Education, and Hunting 101 classes that teach the means and methods of harvesting wild game, as well as specialty clinics that teach about the different types of game variety that you'll find across the state. Lastly, our outreach and recruitment program focuses on our large public events. If you've ever been to the state fair or some of the large festivals that occur around the state and you've seen Texas Parks and Wildlife there, that is our outreach and recruitment staff representing us. In addition, we offer two types of archery training.
Is that correct?
One that is centered under the National Archery in the Schools program, whereby we have nearly 100,000 students across the state shooting archery in their schools. We add approximately 100 new schools every single year, and this program is rapidly growing because kids can use this for their PE credit and learn a new skill, and they love the competitive and safe nature of archery. In addition to that, our community archery program teaches people how to shoot basic archery and basic archery skills, and introduces them to bow hunting and bow fishing.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And with that, that wraps up the presentation piece. And I wanted to let you know that we have many other programs that our agency offers. And so our interpreters do programming at state parks. We have our Texas Outdoor Families program, which takes families camping all over the state. And then we have our Buffalo Soldiers program, who does presentations all around the state of Texas about the Buffalo Soldiers program. And so if you have any questions on any of the other programs that our agency offers, feel free to check out the Co-op TPWD Programs and Sites document that is listed in the handout section. That document is also embedded within the application and is available in the resources section in Argo 2020 as well. So again, we want to help connect you with all of the resources that are available to our agency. Some of these are free, some of these are paid, but if they are paid and it's through your grant program, you can absolutely include the cost to participate in that program in your grant agreement or in your grant application. So with that, that is all we have, and I don't see too many other questions that are open to the general public. Again, I will go ahead and contact each of you individually for to answer some of your chat questions that were more specific to your program. So I will absolutely give you that information. And with that, that is all we have today. And I want to wish everybody the best of luck in your applications and really encourage you to reach out if you have any questions at all. We look forward to hearing about your programs that you do around the state of Texas, and we look forward to communicating with you in the future. So with that, we are going to stop recording and wrap up this webinar. So thank you very much, everybody.